Every once in a while, history hands us something that rewrites everything we thought we understood. Not a ruin, not a weapon, not a fragment of bone, but a book. A collection of words pressed onto a surface so old, so precise, so deliberately constructed, that the moment you look closely, the timeline of human progress we've been taught starts to feel incredibly inadequate. Because books aren't supposed to survive. Paper rots, papyrus crumbles, ink fades, and yet, scattered across different civilizations separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles, a handful of texts have survived in ways that feel almost deliberate, as if someone, somewhere, made sure they would last. And when you examine these books not just as historical curiosities, but as objects, as physical things with weight and material and craft behind them, you start to notice something. The level of knowledge required to create them is staggering. The techniques are too refined. The thinking is too organized. The decisions made by whoever produced them suggest an understanding of preservation, distribution, and communication that we rarely give our ancestors credit for. In this video, we're going to look at 3 of the most remarkable books ever produced by human hands, and we're not going to focus purely on what they say. We're going to focus on what they are, how they were made, and why the more carefully you examine them, the more awe-inspiring human ingenuity becomes. The Book of the Dead. Most people have heard the name, but very few people have actually sat with what the Book of the Dead really is, because the moment you do, the questions start stacking up faster than the answers. First, the name itself is misleading. The Egyptians never called it that. The original title, as closely as it can be translated, means something more like the Book of Coming Forth by Day, which is a completely different concept. It's not a book about death. It's a book about navigation, about moving through a landscape that exists beyond the physical world and finding your way back into light. That framing matters, because once you understand what the text is actually trying to do, the content becomes significantly more profound. The Book of the Dead isn't a single document. It's a collection of over 190 individual spells, hymns, and instructions, compiled across centuries, copied by hand onto papyrus scrolls, and inserted into tombs alongside the dead. The earliest known papyrus versions appear around 1550 BC, during the New Kingdom period. But the ideas inside it are much older, stretching back to the coffin texts, and before those, the pyramid texts of the Old Kingdom, around 2400 years before the Common Era. What makes this strange isn't just the age, it's the consistency. Across thousands of years, dozens of different scribes, regional variations, religious upheavals, and the rise and fall of entire dynasties, the essential structure remained remarkably stable. The same spells appear, the same sequences, the same logic underpinning the journey of the soul through what the Egyptians called the duat, the underworld, the in-between space. Think about what that kind of consistency actually requires. It requires a tradition so carefully maintained and so deeply understood that it could survive translation errors, political change, and the death of entire institutions. Some of the spells deal with memory, specifically with preserving the identity of a deceased so that they could speak their own name in the afterlife and not dissolve into formlessness. Other spells provide passwords, phrases the dead person would need to speak at specific thresholds to pass through guarded gates. There are 42 judges listed in one of the most famous sections, the negative confession, and the deceased must address each one individually, stating what sin they did not commit. That structure, the enumerated list, the specific declaration, the individual accountability, reads less like pure mythology, and more like a highly formalized legal defense of the soul. It reads like a system designed by someone who had thought very carefully about accountability and the mechanics of judgment. But the detail that genuinely drops the jaws of historians is the production. The most elaborate surviving copies of the Book of the Dead are works of staggering craft. The Papyrus of Ani, housed in the British Museum, is one of the finest examples. It runs nearly 24 meters long. The illustrations are rendered in vivid color, with fine brushwork that rivals anything produced in later centuries. The hieroglyphic text is laid out with a precision that suggests a deep understanding of visual composition, of how the eye moves across a page, of how image and word interact to create meaning. And it was made around 1250 BC. That level of integrated design thinking, the deliberate pairing of text with illustration to enhance comprehension, is utterly brilliant. What makes this staggering is that we can actually trace its evolution. The Book of the Dead didn't emerge suddenly. It evolved over 1,000 years. From text carved strictly into the walls of royal pyramids, down to wooden coffins for nobles, and finally to these highly illustrated papyrus scrolls mass-produced for anyone who could afford them. The Papyrus of Ani wasn't a sudden anomaly. It was the masterclass peak of a millennium of iterative design, the Diamond Sutra. On May 11th, 868 AD, someone made a decision that changed the history of human communication. They didn't know it at the time. Nobody wrote it down as a landmark moment. But what was produced on that date is still sitting in the British Library today, and it holds a distinction that most people in the world have never heard of. It is the oldest dated complete printed book ever discovered. The Diamond Sutra is a Buddhist text, one of the most important scriptures in Mahayana Buddhism. The alternative title in translation is The Perfection of Wisdom in 300 lines, though the ideas inside it are considerably more difficult to summarize. The text deals with the nature of perception, the illusion of fixed concepts, and the idea that attachment to any single understanding of reality is itself a form of blindness. But for our purposes here, what matters isn't just the philosophy. The 868 edition of the Diamond Sutra is a scroll approximately 5 meters long, made from 7 strips of printed paper glued together at the edges. The text was printed using woodblock printing, a technique where a craftsman carves the mirror image of an entire page into a wooden block, applies ink, and presses it onto the paper. The result is a clean, uniform reproduction, producible in quantities that hand copying simply cannot match. Pause for a moment and think about what it actually took to produce this. Woodblock printing requires the carver to work in reverse, mirror imaging every character, every line, every piece of the illustration. For a text as precise as the Diamond Sutra, where a single misplaced character could alter the meaning of a passage, this represents an almost inconceivable demand on craftsmanship. And the 868 edition isn't rough. It isn't experimental. The frontispiece illustration, showing the Buddha surrounded by figures, demonstrates a control of the woodblock medium that suggests a practitioner who had been doing this for a very long time. It survived because of where it was hidden. In 1900, a monk named Wang Yuanlu discovered a sealed cave at the Dunhuang Oasis in northwestern China. Behind a plastered wall, untouched for approximately 900 years, was a chamber containing tens of thousands of manuscripts. Sealed into dry darkness, the Diamond Sutra had been preserved almost perfectly. But what strikes people when they examine the scroll closely isn't just the print quality. It's the colophon, the note at the end of the text, that reads, "Reverently made for universal free distribution by Wang Ji on behalf of his 2 parents, on the 13th of the 4th moon of the 9th year of Xiantong." Universal free distribution. In 868 AD, the person who commissioned this book wasn't trying to sell it, hoard it, or restrict it. They were trying to spread it to as many people as possible, for free. Driven by the ancient Buddhist practice of dana, or giving, sponsoring and distributing sacred texts was a way to generate spiritual merit. Long before the internet or the open source movement, the concept that vital information should circulate freely and belong to everyone was already a foundational piece of human culture. The Gutenberg Bible. Around 1455, in the German city of Mainz, a craftsman named Johannes Gutenberg completed something that would, within decades, reshape the entire intellectual landscape of the Western world. He printed the Bible, not by hand, not with woodblocks, with movable type, individual cast metal letters that could be arranged, inked, pressed, rearranged, and used again. A system so efficient and scalable that once it existed, nothing about how human beings communicated could ever go back. The Gutenberg Bible is usually presented as a triumph of technology, and it is. But the more carefully you examine what Gutenberg actually achieved, the more impressive his foresight becomes. Approximately 180 copies of the Gutenberg Bible were printed. Around 49 of them survive today, and the surviving copies reveal something that researchers still marvel at. They are not identical, not in the way you'd expect a printing error to produce variation. The variations are deliberate and beautiful. Different copies show different color schemes in the hand-applied illuminations, different rubrication, the red ink used to mark headings, different decorative initials at the beginning of sections. Each copy was individually finished by hand after printing. Gutenberg understood something about his audience that a purely technical inventor might have missed. The people purchasing these Bibles were accustomed to handwritten, illuminated manuscripts, objects that felt singular and sacred. If the printed Bible felt too mechanical, it would be rejected. So Gutenberg designed a system that was mechanical at its core, but could be finished in a way that felt deeply personal. That is a level of market thinking we rarely attribute to a 15th century craftsman. But the deepest genius is the type itself. Gutenberg's movable type was cast from an alloy of lead, tin, and antimony. The proportions of that alloy are, by modern metallurgical standards, almost optimal. Lead alone would deform under pressure. Tin alone would be too brittle. Antimony adds hardness, and crucially, causes the alloy to expand slightly as it cools, filling the mold completely and producing a razor-sharp letter. Getting those proportions right isn't intuitive, but the secret wasn't magic. It was his day job. Gutenberg was a master goldsmith. He had spent decades working with metal alloys, molds, and precision casting. And contrary to the myth that the Bible was his very first attempt, he spent years running rougher prototypes, printing papal indulgences, a German poem, and a Latin grammar book. He had a learning curve. But by the time he pressed the first page of that Bible, he had mastered his craft so absolutely that the basic formula remained essentially unchanged in the printing industry for over 4 centuries. He produced a book at the very beginning of a new technological era that somehow managed to be definitive. 3 books, 3 different civilizations, 3 completely different moments in human history, and yet each of them carries the same awe-inspiring quality when you look closely enough. Each one appears at a moment that shatters our modern arrogance. Each one demonstrates a level of knowledge, technique, and conceptual sophistication that proves our ancestors were vastly more capable, organized, and brilliant than we often give them credit for. And each one survived against enormous odds in a way that almost feels deliberate. Maybe that's the most powerful thing about these texts, not just what they contain, but the fact that they're still here, still readable, still standing as proof that whoever made them knew, somehow, that eventually someone would come along and need to read them.